This is the setup for the Ohm's Law Lab. So in the interest of time, I've set up two multimeters to simultaneously measure the current and the voltage. So what I have here is for measuring voltage, I have this black wire attached to the common plug on the multimeter. If we trace this around, it plugs into the black port on the power supply. On my multimeter, on the red port that has our voltage, tracking this around, it plugs directly into the red port on our power supply. So that way when I turn this thing on and increase the voltage by turning this knob, I can directly measure the volts in volts on my voltmeter. To measure the current, I'm using this this multimeter that's attached to the power supply. It is plugged into this same red port. This gets traced behind the power supply and plugs in right here to the amperage port on the multimeter. To the black common is attached this test lead with an alligator clip that's connected to our resistor. On the other side of the resistor is an alligator clip that when we trace this back, gets plugged back into the power supply. So these two things will simultaneously measure the voltage in volts and the current in amperage. Okay, so the first measurement that I am going to have will be 0.093 volts. Right now, the reading on the ammeter for the current is 0.013 amps. So we can record that. Still reading 0.01, oh, now it's 2 amps. So that can be a second reading. And then it went back to 0.013 amps. So this can be our three readings, 0.013 amps, 0.012 amps, and 0.013 amps, because it's mostly stable at 0.093 volts. If I were to increase this up to, say, 1.81 volts, or actually stabilize at 0.180 volts, starts off reading 0.025 amps on the multimeter. Now it's reading 0.026 amps and 0.026 again at the time of speaking. Those can be the three measurements for this voltage. At 0.246 volts, the first reading for our current could be 0.037 amps. The second one can be 0.037. And the third can be 0.038. At 0.293 volts, the current is 0.045 amps. Second reading could also be 0.045 amps. And a third reading could be 0.046 amps. At 0.410 volts, our first current reading can be 0.067 amps. Our second can be 0.068 amps. And our third can also be 0.068 amps. Okay. Our next volt reading can be 0.518 volts. The first current that can be associated with that is 0.090 amps. Our second can be 0.090 amps. And our third can be 0.090 amps. Our next reading can be 0.643 volts. The current at that voltage is 0.115 amps. The next reading can be 0.117 amps. And the third reading for the current can be 0.118 amps. Our next voltage can be 0.812 volts. the current at this voltage is 0.153 amps. The second reading of the current can be 0.152 amps. And then the third current reading can be 0.151 amps. Okay, so our next voltage can be 0.930 volts. The current at this voltage is 0.184 amps. A second reading of the current could be 0.190 amps. And a third reading could be 0.188 amps. At 1.006 volts, the current is 0.244 amps. A second reading of the current is 0.246 amps. And a third reading could be 0.247 amps. Well, let's increase this a little bit. At 1. Oh, the voltage is fluctuating crazy. So let's settle to see what's happening. Ooh, the voltage is jumping all over the place. Right now, the current is 0.455 amps, where my voltage is jumping all over the place. Right now, I'm going to turn the knob an awful lot. This should indicate a higher voltage. But our voltage is not increasing, and neither is our current. We may have exceeded the capacity of this resistor, and the maximum current that can flow through would be the 0.44. So we'll drop this back down to 0. And everything would go back to 0. We should be able to get the similar values when we go back up. We were approaching 1.3 when that stopped, so if I drop this down, there we go. So like say 1.2, we should still see it increasing for the current as we were to continue upwards. Yeah, right now we are still below that maximum amperage or that maximum current we saw. So this will be our last reading. At a voltage of 1.219 volts, the current is 0.362 amps. Next current could be 0.349 amps. And the last one could be 0.352 amps. And when I bring it back to 0, no more voltage, no more current.